Welcome to our seventh episode of Football Transfer Markets, and today we are going to cover Egypt. And our guest for today is co-founder and head of sports law of Sports Makers and Partners, Nasser Eldin Assam, who is also a member of an executive committee of International Association for Football Lawyers, also known as AIAF or IAF. Nasser is also a lecturer of sports law at FIFA CIES Executive Program in Sports Management. He is also a lecturer of sports law at ISDE, and today he is going to cover the domestic football transfer regulations of Egypt. So let's go. Nasser, thanks for accepting my invitation to come to have this podcast. And as we spoke before, I think you already know what is the meaning of this podcast, why we organize it, and what's the meaning behind it. And I have a pleasure to have you as a guest. Thanks for coming and joining. And so we are speaking about football transfer markets, but in order to have the full understanding how the transfer market works, we decided to divide this topic into three subcategories. Okay, the first category is the training rewards or the training compensation system alongside the solidarity. The second question is what kind of transfer fees, if the transfer is made against the payment, are common in Egypt domestically, or if the Egyptian club decides to export the player, its local player, locally trained player. Like what is the most common type of transfers? Conditional fees, sell-on fees. If conditional fees, then what kind of fees are common, and other topics related to transfer structuring. Let's call it like transfer structuring. The third question is if there is any standard employment contract form enforced or recommended by the league or FA. And the fourth question, you can cover whatever you want about your domestic jurisdiction, about domestic regulations, about your concerns, your experience, and I will catch it up with you simultaneously by comparisons and so on. So let's start about domestic training compensation system, how it's organized in Egypt.
First of all, Harshad, thank you so much for having me here. It's my pleasure to highlight different domestic regulations related to the football, of course, in different countries, which I'm sure it will help for the development of the international football law on the international level as well. So thank you for that. Of course, for Egypt, we're quite having many football players, having already the country over more than 100 millions. So it's something that's very important, of course, for the football clubs in Egypt to have this training compensation system. But the point that we regretfully we had that the football association, the Egyptian Football Association, is not organizing or not regulating the training compensation on the local market. So it's something that maybe clubs be losing to have training compensation on the local transfers. But at the same time, the Egyptian Federation give protection in a different way, that if a player is registered as amateur player with a club, on the international regulations, you can go and sign a first professional contract without the approval of your club, and then the other club will just get the training compensation, correct? So on the other level, on the Egyptian domestic system, even if the player is registered as an amateur with a club, he cannot go to be transferred and registered with a new club in Egypt as a professional without the approval of his former club. So this is like you are blocking this opportunity or this option for the player to sign a professional contract with another club without the approval. And this maintain or protect the clubs that they can ask for a fee if another club is interested, even if they are registered as amateurs players with them. And of course, the amateur player can be registered with the club up to being until the end of the youth teams until under 20. So could be solving a bit the problem that we are not regulating the training compensation, but still we have another option that a player that, for example, was amateur with a club, and then his club not registered him anymore after, for example, 4 years that he was training this player. In this way, he considered as a free player, and he can join another club, whether as amateur or professional, without his former club getting any compensation. So as long as you are registering the player, you still have the protection because you cannot go to be transferred to another club without your approval. I mean, the former club. But if you deregistered the player, he still can go free without having this obligation to the new club to pay any training compensation in that level.
Do you want to know what the system you described reminded me about? Do you remember the Newcastle versus Eastham case from 1964, the UK case?
Yeah.
They had the similar system where, at the end of the day, the court decided that there is a restraint of trade violation. So, uh, the the my question is a very simple one. On your opinion, just to know your personal opinion as a sports lawyer, what is the ground that the amateur is being deprived to be moved to move himself or herself? Like, what is the ground that the FA adopted this kind of regulation that stops the amateur player to freely move to another club?
Of course, this is what when you like discuss it from the player side is very important for me as a former also professional football player, and I couldn't go to join to the Zamalek club. I had option to go to the Zamalek club, but I couldn't move to sign a professional contract with them when I was 17 years because my former club had to accept, and of course they ask for big money. Maybe you like deprive you or prevent something beneficial for your development as a football player to join a bigger club. So no, I agree that this is something could be have a negative side for the players. That to free movement, of course, and be restrictions that could be considered same what we know for the international as we mentioned could be there is a violation, but no one of the players challenged this system until now before the local courts. Many times you find that some players, because they don't want to sign something with, for example, with this club, their clubs maybe pressures them by not allowing them to transfer to another club, and also same time maybe not making them train with the team. So this is sometimes the clubs abuse their position in that level. So I believe
Article
that
14 of RSTP.
yeah.
Article
So
14 of RSTP, abusive conduct.
yeah. So I believe that until now, no one challenged. We had some recent cases for players that they cannot move to another clubs, although they are not playing with their team, but just putting them in the system on their squad as amateur players. And this is, I believe that maybe this be the first case to change this system at the Egyptian Football Association, because they are a group of players that really complaining from not being able to join new clubs as a professional.
There is another legal standpoint which I would like to highlight because I'm not aware about Egyptian legal system in total, okay? But in many countries of continental law system, in the constitution, in many countries, there is always there in most of the cases there is a clause about freedom of exercising sports. The government must guarantee a right of a person to exercise sports. So in many countries there is a freedom like that. So I would like to know if there is such in Egypt, and isn't there any contradiction with if there is any, isn't there a contradiction with this right or freedom as well?
For us in Egypt, because the player be registered with his club, so far there is no violation for such rule because he's already registered. He can play with one team. So they're not considering there is restriction on his rights because he already accepted to join this team to play with them, and he be continuing to playing with the club.
Well, but yes, I understand he his own will or her own will accepted to join this club and be registered there, but it doesn't mean that the player also accepts to stay there forever registered because the decision to field the player or not field the player is up to the club, right? So in other words, the club can decide to deprive the player from the sporting activity. And from this perspective, isn't there a violation from this point? Because the player also, okay, he entered into these relations, but there is no way out if he wants to exercise his entitlement to sports further from this point. Like, what is your opinion if we review the case from this point? the
I,
situation
I
in
I
our
believe if it's a matter brought to court, to national courts in Egypt, it will be worth a really evaluation and discussion related to that matter. Because if you compare with the international system, and we have, as you said, sometimes a player couldn't move to sign a professional contract. So each rule maybe have a positive and negative. Maybe if a player want to leave, and what we had here in Egypt that happened in some cases, that the players, in order to move as a free player, they go sign to a player abroad. Then the FIFA regulations be applied, and the youth player, for example, he's 18 years old, he signed for a club, another club in Africa, then he transferred back to a club in Egypt again, because he will be acquiring as a professional player in this new club in another country, and he gets the ITC, and then he can move back. Of course, this could be considered as a bridge transfer if he moved and transferred back in same time.
within
Sometimes he go
16
back
weeks.
after 1 year. Yes, but is a matter of, if you see it also from the other side, because it's also important. If a player he's already playing in under 20 national team, for example, okay, and he's registered as amateur player with the club, and he got opportunity from another bigger club in Egypt. If he go just with the training compensation, and if you compare the amounts, maybe he go for very low fee. And I heard in some other countries that they say that compensation is not enough for, imagine a player that could be playing on first national team, he's under 20 or under 19, but he go with the training compensation system inside the country, and the training club don't benefit from the actual amounts that reflect the training compensation, because the amounts will be very lower than what is already included in the FIFA regulations. So if you see in this side, if the player cannot move without the approval of his club, the club actually takes a fair compensation to accept his transfer to new club. And this happened before in Egypt. That the conversation between the new club, that is a more bigger club, wants the player, saying, maybe the agents, maybe the player, say, if you don't accept to transfer me direct with a good or reasonable amount, I will be transferred, assign a professional contract to a club abroad, and then join again the club, and you
To
will not.
another club, yeah, yeah,
Yes,
just
so
like
this
a
is,
circumvention system of the domestic binding registration. I got the
yes,
point how
this
it's
is how
rolled
they
out.
make it in the negotiations. Then the new club also, the former club, maybe reach at the end a fair value for the transfer, or for the real training compensation, that what they be helping this training club after that to develop, of course, more players. So I can see it. Yes, it have also importance that to protect the clubs, because if you go with the small, very small training fee inside the country, also you'll be losing valuable amount that
That's
could.
that's that's where that's very interesting point you highlighted, because I want to emphasize it even further. Look, the logic behind training compensation system is not only the protection of the investor in the sense of training costs. Okay, it's much deeper than it seems from the first glance. And I'm speaking as a in-house lawyer of a club formerly, and mainly when you look at the things from the global perspective, there is one thing: football business entirely as an industry. It relies more on opportunity of the big star player development. Of course, there are some exceptions from the general rule, which there are clubs which can develop excellent players in the terms of quantity. But generally speaking, it's not like this. Like most of the clubs, when they start to develop players in their youth academies, they hope that their youth development program will work in a way that they will have a good big player, which from the percentage perspective can happen like one player from 1,000 players. So in this sense, the training compensation must be constructed in a way that it should protect not only the investors' operating costs, which is the actual training costs which the club borne during the development of the player, but also this loss of opportunity. Like the compensation should be in an amount that could potentially cover this opportunity that the club was searching or was hoping for when the club was developing the player. Not necessarily it must be like a huge amount, but there must be a system behind that must protect the club in a way that the investor who contributes in the football should have a layer of protection for the whole development, not only for one player. So it is also a counterbalance system, because in the same way, the same club which has a youth academy, when this club takes the player, the same rules apply to this club. So it's counterbalanced, but deployment of the training compensation is much more effective system rather the one that you described, that binding the player with the registration rights, because it can create rather more problems than solve problems. And both from the player's perspective and from the club's perspective, because as you just literally described to me, the circumvention of this system, which is discussed during negotiations, is to take away the player to another club, register the player there. Obviously, I suppose the new club from the foreign country will be category 4 club, correct? Yeah. And after 6 months, register the player back to Egypt, which doesn't make any sense, because the player just loses 6 months of his career. The club actually doesn't receive anything, so nobody is happy. But the training compensation system is here to solve these problems.
Yes,
And
but this is interesting what you are saying, that we want to solve the problem and to have a fair system at the end between all parties, not one to benefit more, but also to protect the rights of the players and of the club at the same time. Because if you need to protect all and keep balance between all stakeholders, because if you don't keep balance and keep all the interests of all parties, the system will collapse. But I will tell you something interesting the Egyptian Federation had did at that time when this case was raised about the player, under 20 national team player who was threatening to go back and go again to Egypt. So the Egyptian Federation at that time took a decision that even if the player transferred to a club abroad and he go back within 2 years from this transfer, or from this, of course, wrestling as a professional, if he was an amateur player, his former club will still take a training compensation, and the calculation of this training compensation was additional one based on the average of the first team players annual salaries. So it depends which club he's going to. If you're going to top clubs, maybe the average of the salaries is 2 million Egyptian pound, for example. If you go to a middle club, maybe the average of the salaries of the first team players is 1 million. So the compensation, or the training compensation, or additional one, will be equal to the average of the salaries of this club. I believe something like that, because the training compensation system at FIFA is fixed with the schedule. If club in first division or second division, depend on the categories of the clubs, but it's fixed amount. So this one is more different because it make it more adapted to the real financial status of the club, with comparing it to the average salaries of the players. So it's also one idea that happened. And after this rule was made, the clubs refrained from doing this bridge transfer to go even for 4 months, 6 months. Sometimes the player even not traveling from Egypt. It's just on the documents. Signed for a club in Africa, fourth division, and he's still in Egypt just for these 6 months and then be registered with the new club in Egypt. So with this new rule also adopted by the Egyptian Federation, it put the clubs back to the table of the negotiations, and they agreed about fair compensation for the transfer at the end, because one club don't want to lose and go, for example, for long proceedings, and they make both clubs to reach a fair value for the transfer of the player.
well, recently we were covering Russia, and in Russia they also have one installment payment as a training compensation, which also is connected to the player's remuneration. And also, Yuri Zaitsev was covering the matter, and he brought up a very interesting example where, because of this rule, it would be beneficial for the player to be transferred abroad. Really, not in a bridge transfer, but really in reality, to be transferred abroad rather than to a Russian club domestically, because the amount would be so high that nobody would just accept
Yeah.
the player for this amount. So I suppose training compensation is more or less covered in the sense of highlighting the issues that are there, and hopefully, I suppose sooner or later, a full system will be deployed there, which will protect every stakeholder in the system, not only this party or that party. And what about solidarity? So is there any solidarity mechanism or?
No, it's same, for all this kind of compensation is also not regulated in the Egyptian Federation, but this is something that I highly like recommend the Football Association to regulate it immediately because, and I believe it is going to be implemented because, we had recently a new sports law in Egypt that already was adopted like in 2017, and this was changing the system of legal basis for the clubs that allowed the investors to establish private clubs in Egypt. Before it was always all clubs like in association
Mm,
format, but now they allowed private clubs, and many of the big investors had clubs now in Egypt. Like also the owners of Aston Villa clubs, they have club in Egypt because they are Egyptian, so they have also club, and many other investors had the same investing in Egypt. As I said to you, you see also there's a potential. You see, you have Mohamed Salah, one of the
yeah, I
examples that
know. Of
we
course,
see
I've
of the
my
market.
f- my friend, I was and am a big fan of Salah because when I first watched him playing, he was in Roma, I suppose, previously, right?
Yes,
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 when I saw his first match, I was like, man, this guy has a really big future because the speed which I saw that he accelerated was enormously fast, you know. So like, yeah, I know who is Mohamed Salah. I
yeah.
I, I know.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because Egypt as well is most successful national team on the continental level in Africa, winning the African Cup of Nations. So it always also interesting also for investors to uh, uh, they are here in Egypt. So that's why recently it encouraged more people to invest in Egypt in football academies and football clubs as well. And now they reach the first division, so it's getting also more competitive for the league. And I believe that this will make the system, the federation, to be developing also the regulations more faster than before.
Yeah, yeah. Let's hope for it. So
Yeah, you can imagine, for example, Salah when there was talks about his transfer from Liverpool to Saudi Arabia. So the Egyptian club was waiting, for this deal to happen because he
for
heard the
solidarity.
amounts about 200 million. So they was going to get like 10 million euros, something like that. So for sure, this solidarity is very important and is also became is part of the clubs how they benefit. Even when he go from Roma to Liverpool, they get 2 million euros. So it's also big amount for Egyptian club. So I believe also it's important for the local market because we have transfers, and maybe we'll speak about it in the second topic, how much the amount of the transfer fees. And this transfer fees is with higher amounts that require also to consider the solidarity part of it for the clubs.
Yeah, so let's jump directly to the second question in this case because you already made the transition. So let's cover this. So how the things are working in a transfer market from the structural perspective, how it's being organized. Because and before just starting the topic, I just want to know if our experience is the same in this case. Recently, after the clearinghouse started to work, well, relatively work because there are some issues in relation to the speed of the EPP review, etc. But I think sooner or later it will be solved. So I noticed that the significant increase, which is highly noticeable in the industry, is to have waiver agreements in exchange of sell-on fee. Do you also experience this or not? Waiver of international training compensation in exchange of sell-on fee.
It's happening a lot because Egyptian clubs in the first division they consider of the highest level in Africa, and that's why they make compensation according to the training compensation like 30,000 US dollars per year. And if you compare also economically now in Egypt, this amount is if you consider like 3 years, only 3 years training compensation, for example, 9,000 US dollars. This amount is reaching more than 4.5 million Egyptian pounds, which is very high amount for many of clubs to. It's making the clubs when they sign young players, maybe they have this waiver in order to being able to register the player. If they don't have that, maybe they don't sign the player because they know after that it will come from for them with high amount that they couldn't pay. So this is something also you can see that the economic situation or status sometimes also affect the football in a different way with the devaluation of the currency in Egypt and also with the rules of the FIFA, which is making it fixed amounts that could be higher than the actual training value now, because this 30,000 is already set long time ago. If you compare now with the actual training cost for Egyptian club, it will not be that amount per year. So I believe that this system also need to be reviewed by FIFA in order to see how it could be matching the actual costs for the training clubs or for the new clubs that the players will be joining. Because if that, maybe it will not be waived and still could be paid, plus a sell-on fee, as you said, that could be now the alternative option for the Egyptian clubs if they sign a player that they say they require a waiver and then they can put a sell-on fee. And this has happened many times. I see with all my clients in Egypt that they ask for that before they sign these new players, especially from African young players. And of course, the systems that African young players always like to come as a step for Egypt, for a better country, and then maybe after that they move to Europe.
Well, you touched very sensitive topic, the revision of the international training caused by FIFA. So I'm thinking about this for 8 years because mainly when we work with clubs, with different clubs, every time it's the same topic that these amounts are extremely high and not justified for us. The last part of the sentence is very important. Not justified for us. So why it matters? We know the CAS jurisprudence, right? And the principle that lies behind the training costs. That the principle is that the new club must pay an amount which is deemed presumable that it should be the amount that if that new club would develop the player, correct?
Yes.
So the logic behind is like that. And when you explain it to the clubs who are going to engage a new player, and when you tell them the amount, and I'm speaking about the real calculation of the real player factor, everything. There is a formula to calculate. Even if you calculate by this formula, you see a huge deviation. For instance, I did a calculation for one of the clubs about the player factor, and I found out that the training cost for this club is 15,000, 1 5. But this club is assigned category 3, which is 30. And obviously, the club's management raises valid question. If our training costs in reality are twice as lower than FIFA has set as a golden average, okay? Why we must pay twice more? What's the logic behind it? And also, I understand FIFA as well because you cannot just take into consideration the every country available because okay, within the UEFA framework, within the licensing procedure, every club provides the information about its youth expenses. If digging further, it is possible to understand what are the actual amounts. But this, I think that this system which we have at the moment is problematic. It is needed to be reviewed, but not changed. Okay, this is important. But what I try to say, the system more or less is effective, understandable by everybody. We have reached jurisprudence on it. It's an already established mechanism, also coming from 2001 after the Bosman case between the agreement between European Commission, FIFA, and UEFA. Everybody knows this. But the thing is that the problem is related to the costs, which you just highlighted. You see, you also highlighted that the costs are significant. So I suppose that FIFA must just start for research to find out what is the actual reasonable cost to protect also the low tier clubs, not only the top tier clubs. Let's call it balance of probabilities in terms of governance. This is about the cost, in my opinion.
No, is important what you said, because you just mentioned the example of the training compensation, the actual one and the FIFA one was just double. Okay. But I can tell you the 30,000 US dollars that one of the top Egyptian clubs that they have, it can be cost if a player like 18 years old, it costs for the whole team for 1 year, not just double for, you can imagine like this 30,000 is the cost of one team per year because it's like almost now amount the $30,000 is around like 1.5 million Egyptian pounds. So it's a cost of one news team with 25 players per year. So it could be even more than 20 times, not just two times. And for
Well,
that, what I believe that you need the system, as you said, it should be maintained because also the training clubs should be paying, receiving some amounts, and the new clubs that they are player are joining should be compensating this club. But then we need to move to be more flexible related to each country, each club, to have, find the systems that be matching with the actual cost for the new clubs more. I know it's not easy to put some one rule be working with every,
all the planet, yeah.
but you need to see something that you cannot say this amount for all Africa top clubs. No, not all countries same, not economically same, you know, especially when you put the currency with US dollars. So you are not even know the local currency, how much it will be.
Yeah, what about the transfer structure in general when we are speaking about domestic transfers? How it's being structured? Is buyout clause common or release clause or liquidated damage clause? Are they common or there is a fixed transfer fee? How usually football stakeholders structure the transfer in general?
The most common that you agree about a fixed transfer fee plus percent maybe for future transfer.
Selling fee.
Yeah, sell-on fee. So in addition, now recently the clubs became more developed that they also add bonuses according to the performance of the player as well. Like if the club win the league, win a tournament, if the player scores some number of goals, of if he participated, for example, in certain matches, you can see different bonuses scheme be now developed within the Egyptian clubs in domestic transfers. But the most common, of course, is the fixed transfer fee plus the sell-on fee as well. Some of the clubs, of the big clubs, I can say, they also put clauses in order to be allowed to get their player back.
Buyback options.
Yes, buyback option. So this is be set as well in the transfer agreements that allows a club to get this player after first year or second year, of course, with different amounts depending on the years the player spent with his new club. So this also became more common from the top Egyptian clubs like Zamalek, Ahli, Pyramids. These clubs also made these rules now.
What is your view on buyback options from the legal standpoint?
Of course, you know, it's sometimes you feel like it's deprives a new club from really getting the fair transfer fee because maybe the player after joining these clubs, you know, they more developed and they becoming getting even more higher value for the former club, and in that way they put maybe certain amounts that not compensate them. But at the end, if you see the free will of the parties when they get the player on transfer at that time and they accepted the buyback option, this for his former club, also it get benefit maybe the club for the player during the period that he will be playing with them. I believe that this buyback option it also could be valid because there is a free will between the parties that when they negotiated. So it also maybe benefits the new clubs that they get the using the services for services of the player during the time that he will be playing with them. Plus, they will get also additional compensation if the club decided to buy back the player again. So then it will be considered about the amounts that will be reached during these negotiations. It could be fair at the end because they benefit from a player maybe with lower transfer fee and they benefit from it on sport level. Plus, they get also another sell-on fee maybe from future also when the player get back. So anyway, it will be subject for negotiation between the parties, and I believe that it's fine because it also allows the transfer of the players more easily.
Do you think that there is a thin line between the will of the parties, which you just mentioned, and the TPI rule violation?
Yes, this is something what we consider, but if you can see that the player is accepting to go back with certain years of contract as employment contract with his former club with salaries already agreed, it will not be influenced because you know the player could have a buyout clause in his contract. correct? And then he used this buyout clause
Yeah, but the issue is, yeah, I understand your standpoint and
to move to the buyout
the
clause at the end, that he can put
no, 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 no,
something.
no. I'm asking about different thing. You tell me from the angle of the player's perspective,
Mm.
but I'm asking about having an influence on the new club by the former club.
Yes, but this is option is not influencing or the club to not to transfer him to another club. If you're asking or putting something that they cannot transfer the player to another club without their approval, this yes something could be influence that be in violation. But if you are saying that I have the option to get the player back, if you exercise this option is different thing. It's like a second transfer could be considered same as the player could use also an option of moving from the amount to buy out. So I don't see that there is a violation if it is the former club that exercise this option to buy back the player again, services again.
We are speaking about scenario when there is no an amount fixed beforehand, right?
No, it's there is amount be agreed, of course, in the contract. But if there is no amount set in the contract, it will be up to the negotiations.
No, I mean, if the buyback option is stipulated as a priority, but not there is no any minimum amount mentioned there. I suppose in this case there is no TPI. But if the parties mention that, for example, the buyback option shall be no less than 200k or 300k,
Hmm.
there is somewhat of a risk to fall under the influence part because you restrict the not the performance, but the sports planning of the new club. From this angle, I think there might be a violation.
It's interesting what you are saying, but it's same if you know if the club if the player put a buyout clause in his contract with the club, it also affects the sporting plan of the club, because maybe after 1 year he used this buyout clause and he moved to a new club. You have a lot of cases that happen. Of course, Neymar is the most known one of it, and it's
Well,
affecting
also
the sporting plan for the club.
it's also a very interesting perspective, and yeah, like right now we are diving into the in my country, at least in my jurisdiction, in my school of law, it's called like competition between laws. When you have the TPI rule and you have Article 17, and they compete with each other, so lex specialis shall take in. So yeah, it's very interesting.
But now everything will be under review because you have to receive the Sanadiara, and if you really want to make international system applicable, is very hard now because you
Yeah,
have a different law, national system.
It's good that you mentioned this because what is your view about the Aras case? Let's just speak about it just 5-10 minutes because I'm really curious about your view because I also have mine, and then the first I had another opinion and then I changed my opinion. So I want to know yours and I will then tell mine. So let's just have a small discussion.
Yes, of course, it's quite interesting because when you consider anything that could be in violation with the EU law, because it's restricts the free movement, of course, of the players. This would could be anything could lie under that, If
Mhm.
you evaluate, like you can consider anything like also put this as a restriction. So to what extent that will be reaching? Because at the same time, the clubs be really putting, of course, in signing the players. And if they are not protected to get or collect, I believe that already is quite interesting because the clubs be investing in the transfer of the players and putting big values or big amounts, and then you can see if they have no opportunity to protect their investment or the values that they are putting. This could be also not fair from the other side. So that's why I'm saying that, of course, it could be have a bit of restriction for the movement of the player sometimes, but at the same time, when the player be the one breaching his contract, is not something that restriction in general. It's not like Bosman. Bosman, he was a free player, his contract is finished, but he cannot move. Here is different. Here the player is already terminated the contract without just cause. So you have a contract and you have breached it. So you need to pay a compensation. Of course, the value of the compensation could be upscale because if the new club must also be liable, jointly liable and severally liable for it. So, as you said, you change your mind. So it depends if you see it. I was a professional football player. If I see from the player perspective that this amount that could be high amount for him to player really make a termination for the contract or violation of the contract without just cause, still he should bear consequences, legal consequences. And that's why, the fundamental, like what we say, the FIFA contractual stability, which is very important principle because in football is different. If he terminates the contract and he left during the season, as you said, it affects the sport plan of the club. It's not easy that just I'll bring another player and will be substituted as another employee. It's not like in another different or other sides of business. So if you see it from one side of the player, yes, you can see there is a barrier for the player to move to a new club. And it could be fair if the player cannot move because of this system that it could be in violation with the EU law. But at the end, same time also, this will be not protecting the players in case of the player had violated the contract. So still there could be legal consequence on the player with a fair compensation because at the end this is a fair compensation that be decided by FIFA. For example, if I pay transfer fee with 100 million and then the player after 1 year he moved, so without just cause, then how much should be compensated? So there are damages that should be compensated, and this is the normal compensation system everywhere that to compensate you from the damages that you already bear. So how it will be without being also violating the rights of the players as employees as well is quite interesting how it will be reached because at the end it's very hard to reach a balance between both sides, especially with the high amounts that are putting now in the football players.
Can I give you my opinion?
Yeah, sure.
Look, at first I was like, this is Bosman too. And then uh, my background before sports law is public law, okay, constitutional law. And then I remembered what happens when constitutional court finds that some law of the country is against constitution. What happens? The parliament doesn't change all the law. The parliament just adopts the part which is against constitution in the line with which the court emphasizes. So I suppose, taking into account that FIFA is the world governing football body, the same principles and the same logic will happen. What I try to say, at the first glance, I came to this conclusion that the court highlighted about the not an abusive but restrictive parts of the RSTP. And what are the restrictive parts within the meaning of free movement? There are 2 points. There are two
Mm.
points. The first point is joint and several liability presumption of the new club. And the second point is the rejection of the ITC in case of the Article 17 violation. So I think if FIFA just removes the presumption of joint and several liability, the presumption only, I do not speak about the rule itself. The rule will stay, but just the word presumption. It is presumed. Yes, it is written, it is presumed. If FIFA just removes this part and also removes the ITC rejection part, the current RSTP will be in line with the court's decision's substance.
Yes, it will be quite interesting how you can reach systems that be balanced between the protection of course, the football stakeholders, and same time also not to be in violation with EU law at the end. So I hope so, because at the end, it's also could be affecting negatively all the stakeholders at the same time, not just
If,
the not just the clubs, but also the players, and what
of
amounts could
course,
be
because
received and salaries and all this.
yeah, sure, obviously. So let's jump to the third question about standard contract form. And I want to highlight a statement from FIFPro years ago, which was constituting an abuse in Egypt about blank contract signing by the players. So I'm aware that Egypt Football Federation, Football Association has standard contract form. The question is it mandatory for the clubs to use or is it just recommended? The second sub-question, subcategory of the question is that is there any abuse by the clubs on this matter, which FIFPro once stated that there is.
So in many countries, they have, as you said, the standard contract for the clubs and the football players, like employment standard contract. In the Egyptian Federation, also they make this standard contract, and it's already printed one. So it's not just a template that they must follow, but it's a template that you have to buy it from the federation. So each player to be registered with Egyptian club, he must sign 4 copies of this original template of the Egyptian standard contract from the federation. This standard contract has already printed clauses in it, and just remaining the duration of the contract, the name of the parties, the of course the salaries up to 5 years. If you will be the duration 5 years, that be missing to add them. In
Yeah, I know.
addition to, yeah,
I know how it's structured. I know how there are blank parts left. There are some difficulties related to it. But the question is about the following: what is your opinion? Is this contract mandate? I understood that this
yes,
contract is mandatory.
yes. First of all, I say to you, it's mandatory that the players to be registered with the Egyptian club to sign 4 copies of this standard contract of the federation. This is a mandatory because the clubs in Egypt cannot register the new players without the player signing the 4 contracts, and the 4 contracts be, or 4 copies be identical, of course, with all the information written in it. Why 4 copies of this standard contract? Because at the end, after registration of these copies of the contract, one of them go to the club after the officialization from the federation, one go to the player, and 2 be with the federation. One of the federation, one with the local association where the club belong. So that's why they require the 4 original copies of the standard contract to be signed. But as I said, the blank contracts, what you are saying about them, for example, if you say that some people say that the player sign a blank contract, no, the contract and this problem is not happening for all players, but some of the players go sign these 4 copies without completing the information that needed to be written in it, like the duration of the contract, the value of the contract, or the additional clauses that can be also added. So this is, of course, something that sometimes happen, but is not, of course, happening for the players that they say, no, I must fill in the contract
How
before.
much The question is, how much are parties free to negotiate? Do the parties have freedom to negotiate additional terms, rights, and obligations, or financial is clear, I understand, but what about rights and obligations? For example, the parties do not agree with the wording of the contract template form, and they would do, they want to have another wording of, let's say, rights and obligations. What happens?
Okay, you will find the rights and obligations that included as a printed in the contract. It's the basics one, so it not go for further details. So if you want to add another obligations, you can add them, as long as they are not violating, of course, the rules. You can still add them. So, but the main obligations that's already included in the contract is the fundamental one for
I
the
know, I know.
minimum rights. So this is not to
No, no, no. The question is about the wording, not the rule per se. For example, the parties, uh, yeah, the parties do not agree with the wording stipulated in the contract form, and they want to change it. Can they just stipulate, for example, that Article 3.2 in the contract or whatever is not applicable to this contract, or federation doesn't allow this? How this works?
look. Some many times also the federation, of course, when they review the additional clauses with something fundamental, so they will be rejecting it. But if, for example, additional thing for a clause that not affecting the fundamental rights of both parties or mandatory rule, no, they will allow it. So it depends about what you are changing in the contract. So it's a discretion more to the federation. Sometimes you talk with them, say no, we agreed about that, say no, this is in violation. Sometimes happen this kind of talks when the federation be approving the employment contract. But I believe that there is nothing, like I can tell you something maybe for the image rights. So let's say there is a clause related to the image rights in the printed version of the template of the federation, but the parties had agreement different from this clause. The federation will not be objecting this different agreement because at the end it's special conditions that be negotiated and agreed between both parties. So it's economic way related to this image rights matter, and it's most the players has these clauses in their templates additional related to the image rights, and the federation approve, of course, these amendments or additional clause some articles that already printed or included in the template of the standard contract.
Okay, I think we also covered the third question. And the fourth question, you choose the topic about your own domestic jurisdiction, what you want to highlight, what you want to speak about, and let's discuss it.
Uh, Actually, I see that uh, you actually, Ashot, you already covered the most interesting and important topics related to the football transfers and football business for these three main topics you already we discussed. Of course, there are different maybe things that related to each country, but what I can say it's maybe to more highlight about in Egypt, the NDRC is one important thing that we have to implement on the national level. And this is something I already spoke about it before and already included in the statute of the federation, but unfortunately is not yet enforced professionally to be working as that. So one of the most important things that I have to say to protect the rights of the players, we need to establish the NDRC in the Egyptian Federation. We need to set procedural rules clear for the duration and for accelerating, because sometimes you found cases for players that stay for a long time, and this of course hinders the fundamental rights of the players. One another rule as well I can highlight that already was included in the national regulations, but now could be different. It was before allowed for the Egyptian clubs to terminate unilaterally the contract with the player at the end of the season within 15 days. And the federation was saying that the club just pay 10% from the following year as a compensation. So this also is violate, of course, FIFA rules and should be changed because violates the rights and fundamental rights of the players that they have employment contract, and then you allow just the club unilaterally to terminate it and just to take very, very small compensation, not even the remaining period of the contract. This is also something that need to be immediately reformed. They made, I can say, that they changed it in the template of the employment contracts, but still in the regulations is not amended.
By the way, what about broadcasting rights in Egypt?
Broadcasting rights in Egypt is already before was sold collectively. I was in 2012, back 2012, I assisted legally to establish the first professional league between all the clubs in Egypt. And at that time, I put the standards that they be selling the rights, the broadcasting rights collectively. But then, same like in Italy, they have, for example, 3 years agreement. But then after this time of the agreement, it returned back again to be each club sell its rights individually. Yes, we have each club sell its rights individually. Sometimes happen some problems. Now they're all selling to the same TV broadcasting on sports in Egypt, and you can see that they negotiate with each club individually to agree about the amounts to be paid for the broadcasting rights. Of course, I recommend the collectively selling for the broadcasting rights in order to maintain the fair distribution of the income for the broadcasting rights, because now you can find the big ratio difference between the biggest clubs and the other clubs. So this is something that could be affecting also the competitive status for the league if some clubs getting more amounts than the others. And this, I believe, that should be returned again back, and the league to be obliging the clubs to be selling all the rights collectively or the broadcasting rights. It was going to be done last year. I believe it was postponed again. So maybe in the next 2 years, there is a decision again to sell the rights collectively.
Well, as always and as usual, it's the same principle. Winner gets it all. So I suppose the most successful clubs that will have the highest compensation for the broadcasting of their games. That's why the solidarity in the broadcasting is also important. I mean, the solidarity is a principle, not the solidarity we know from the regulations. Well,
Yeah.
Nasser, I suppose we covered most of the important, let's say, affairs and relations covering the football industry in Egypt within this limited time. It was a great pleasure to have this discussion with you. I suppose you also liked it.
Thank you so much for that interesting conversation, and really that tackling this important and for Egypt is, I believe, highlighting that. I hope it be beneficial for different stakeholders and for also for all the different stakeholders to know the rights and how the situation also internationally, besides the different between the status internationally and locally. And I believe this would help in, I hope it help in the more development for the football regulatory reforms in Egypt during this period. And I thank you also for highlighting all the examples also from other local markets, which should be, I think this is what bring really benefit for different people from the discussion that allow everyone to exchange the experience, and then we benefit from these outcomes of the discussions.
Yeah, that's the meaning of this project, to have experts from their own jurisdictions to construct the bridges and network of bridges, a system of bridges where other experts can dive into the regulations of the other jurisdictions to know what they did, what is a good example to review, and why not this at the end of the day have a can have an excellent impact on the regulatory reforms one country decides to organize.
No, I
Okay.
agree with you. I agree with you, and especially what I say to you related to the outstanding payments for players or for clubs that FIFA recently, of course, amended its regulations and included now in the decisions that could be if the payments not paid within certain period, that a transfer ban will be imposed temporarily for three transfer windows on the clubs until they pay, and then when they pay, they lift the ban immediately. So this, for example, something that already enforced in Egypt like more than 15 years ago for for the system. And I remember when we was discussing in one of the AIF congresses with FIFA at that time, think back to 2014, the system was if you are not paying, you maybe receive a 6 points deduction. So I say, yes, there is a disciplinary sanction, but it's not helping the creditor to receive the money more quicker, because when you deduct the points, then he say, anyway, I deduct the points, so it will need more time to get the money again. But I think FIFA, when they change and make this temporary ban, it's allowed to more better system in order to encourage the debtors to pay the debt before already sanctioned. So even if they pay, they will not be returning the points again. So I think this is more effective system that be applied. And when we discuss it, I say what's going in Egypt, then it was changed on the international level. So it's also something that could be a system or model enforced or applied in one of the countries that could be also interesting to be helping in more benefits for the international level or also for another countries.
Well, from other perspective, there is also one interesting point that when you deduct points from a club, even in case of the violation of their obligations, it it not only doesn't motivate the club to comply with the decision, but it demotivates the club to, to comply with the decision. Why? Because if the club is deducted 6 points, it affects the club's performance during the season. If it
Yeah.
affects the club during the season, the club is deprived from the not deprived, but the this fact decreases the potential economic activity of the same club. So it
Yes.
makes sense to try to heal the club, to heal it instead of just punishing directly.
It's not
Yeah,
helping at the end. So
yeah.
that's why
At least
yes, that's why I say the discussion is always important, and highlighting the local is not less important than just discussing the international aspects. It's also important. That's why what you are doing is I congratulate you for this interesting initiative, what you are doing to highlight the local markets in different aspects.
Well, thank you once again.
Thank you so much, my friend. I hope it was good for everyone. And I really thank you for this interesting. Hope to see you soon, my friend.